I didn't say a word when they handed me that eviction notice. I just slid the 1923 water rights deed across the table and watched their confident smiles collapse. 35 luxury homes had just turned into lakefront property overnight, and the look on their faces was almost worth everything they'd put me through. The Willowbrook Estates HOA thought they could steal my grandfather's farm while I was overseas. They thought wrong. My name's Jake Morrison. I'm 34 years old, an Army Corps of Engineers veteran, and the third-generation owner of 47 acres of Texas land that's been in my family since 1955. That land isn't just dirt and fences. It's history, sweat, and the kind of legacy that's supposed to outlive you. And the story I'm about to tell you isn't about revenge. It's about justice, gravity, and one very angry dam. It all started with my grandfather, Robert Pops Morrison. He was the kind of man who believed a person's worth came from what they built for others. Back in the 50s, Austin was just a sleepy college town, all barbecue smoke and blue skies. Pops bought the land cheap, planted cattle, and decided to help his neighbors the best way he knew how, with water. In 1978, he built a small earthen dam on our property, designed to collect rainwater and share it downstream during dry seasons. The Army Corps even helped him draw up the plans, stamped and signed. That meant federal oversight, permanent and untouchable. Pops always said, "Water's life, boy. You take care of the land, it'll take care of you." He couldn't have guessed how right he'd be. I spent 2 tours in Afghanistan building wells and restoring water systems in the middle of deserts. You learn fast out there. Water brings people together, and it also makes them fight like hell. When Pops passed while I was still deployed, the property went into a trust. My sister Sarah, bless her heart, lives in California and knows about as much about Texas land law as I do about surfing. She kept up the taxes, but never looked at the assessments. That's where everything started to go wrong. When I came home in August 2023, I expected to see Pops's pastures shining under the Texas sun. Instead, I saw survey stakes, bulldozers, and concrete trucks. My back 40, the best part of the land, had turned into a construction site. I followed the crunch of gravel under my boots until I found a foreman with a clipboard who looked more annoyed than guilty. He said, "Sorry, buddy, this is Willowbrook Estates property now. We got permits and everything." Permits. That word still makes my skin crawl. I called the police, hoping for common sense. Officer Martinez showed up, awkward as a kid at a wedding. He explained that the HOA had filed something called an adverse possession claim. Basically, they said the land was abandoned, improved it, and under some ancient law, that made it theirs. Only problem? They improved it by stealing it. And that's when she showed up, Margaret Maggie Thornwell herself, rolling up in a golf cart like some kind of suburban warlord. She smiled at me, all perfume and fake sympathy. "Your family abandoned this land, honey," she said sweetly. "We're just putting it to good use for the community." I'll never forget that tone, the kind that says I already own you. Her husband, Rick, the city councilman, had quietly pushed through emergency zoning changes while I was still overseas. Agricultural land turned residential overnight, and my family's legacy turned into their new investment portfolio. The more I looked around, the clearer it got. They weren't building homes. They were building their empire. But what set my blood boiling was the creek. The one Pops had dammed all those years ago, the one that kept his cattle alive and fed half a dozen neighbors' farms during dry years. Maggie's construction crews had rerouted it, a lazy, S-shaped trickle where a strong current used to be. Every day, the water level dropped. Every day, the dam that had stood solid for 45 years sank lower. Pops's hard work was dying right in front of me. That night, I sat on the porch, the air thick with cedar pollen and diesel exhaust from their machinery, and I made a decision. This wasn't going to be another story about a veteran getting walked over by paperwork and politics. This was going to be a story about standing your ground, with a little help from engineering and federal law. The next morning, I drove straight to the county courthouse. You don't need to be a lawyer to read between the lines, just patience and coffee strong enough to burn through frustration. After hours of flipping through dusty files, I found gold. Pops's original 1978 dam construction permit. Army Corps of Engineers, signed and sealed. Federal jurisdiction. That meant any changes to that dam, that creek, or that watershed fell under federal authority, not local zoning or HOA nonsense. My hands were shaking when I read it. Pops had built me the ultimate weapon, and he didn't even know it. Then came the real discovery. A folded yellow document buried in a water rights file dated 1923. It was a deed. My great-grandfather had bought senior water rights to Willow Creek almost a century ago. Older than the HOA, older than the city, older than every single McMansion standing on that stolen dirt. In Texas, senior water rights are sacred. Whoever holds them controls the flow. I suddenly realized this wasn't just a land dispute. This was federal water law. And Maggie had no idea she'd built her kingdom downstream from a ticking time bomb. I stepped outside into the blazing sun, the courthouse door slamming behind me. The noise echoed in my chest like a promise. This wasn't going to end with court filings and polite letters. This was going to end where it started, at that dam. I wasn't going to destroy her homes. I was going to give them a taste of the natural water they'd stolen. But before any of that could happen, I had to play their game. Maggie and Rick turned up the heat. Code violations, fake safety reports, wellness checks to make me look unstable. The kind of bureaucratic harassment that breaks most people down. It almost worked, too. But every time I felt that doubt creeping in, I'd walk out to Pop's dam, kneel by the water, and remember his words. You take care of the land, it'll take care of you. Now the land was asking me to return the favor. They thought they were untouchable behind their HOA rules and local connections. But they forgot something important. I'm not just a landowner. I'm an engineer who specializes in water flow, flood control, and pressure systems. And I know exactly what happens when you build downstream from a dam you don't own. So when they served me that eviction notice, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled, slid that 1923 deed across the table, and watched 35 homeowners realize that their dream community sat on stolen water. The look on Maggie's face was worth the years of fighting that led to that moment. The HOA wasn't ready for someone like me. Someone who knew that water always finds its way home. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, because what you're about to hear is the most satisfying HOA takedown you'll ever see. One that involves federal water law, engineering, and the unstoppable power of gravity. This is the story of how one veteran, one forgotten dam, and one stolen creek reminded a town that you can't steal what nature protects. It's about legacy. It's about land. And it's about the moment I opened those spillway gates, not to destroy, but to set things right. And trust me, when the water started flowing, so did the truth. My name's Jake Morrison, and before all of this turned into a war between me and the HOA, it was just home. 47 acres of Texas soil that smelled like mesquite after the rain, land my grandfather called the kind of earth that holds a man's story. Pops bought it back in 1955 when Austin was still a small-town secret and a handshake meant more than a contract. He used to say that the world was getting faster, meaner, and louder, but good land stayed honest. He was right about that. Growing up there was simple. Every morning the sun crawled over the hills and touched the water on the little dam Pops built himself. It wasn't much to look at. Just an earthen mound and a few rusted gates, but to me it looked like a miracle. That dam fed our cattle, kept the grass green, and made sure our neighbors had enough water when droughts hit. Pops built it not to make money but to help people, and that's the kind of lesson that sticks to your bones. I used to follow him around. a gangly kid with scraped knees, watching how he treated that land like family. He'd test the water, patch up the banks, and whistle while he worked. "You don't own land, Jake," he'd tell me. "You take care of it for the next folks who will." He had a saying for everything. My favorite was, "Water's got memory. Treat it right, and it'll remember you." Back then, I thought it was just old man talk. Turns out he was giving me the blueprint for everything I'd need later. In the summers, we'd fish by the dam, and he'd point downstream, showing me how the creek twisted through other farms. "That's life," he'd say. "Everything connected. What we do here decides what happens down there." Pops didn't have fancy degrees or big words, but he understood nature better than any engineer I've ever met. He even worked with the Army Corps of Engineers back in the 70s when he formalized the dam. That's how I first learned what federal jurisdiction meant, though I didn't appreciate it then. It was just paperwork to me. But that paperwork, the permits, the signatures, the diagrams, would become my shield decades later. When I got older, the world started calling louder than the ranch. Pops wanted me to see it, to serve something bigger than myself. So I enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers. Turns out, there's not much difference between managing water in Texas and managing it in Afghanistan, except the stakes are higher and the bullets fly faster. Over there, I learned how water can be both a gift and a weapon. Villages rise and fall on whether you can make the desert bloom. I saw how desperate people can get when you take away their lifeline. Maybe that's why what happened later hit me so hard. While I was overseas, Pops passed away quietly in his sleep. My sister Sarah called me on a scratchy satellite line, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She told me not to worry, that she'd handle the estate until I got home. Sarah's a good person, heart as big as Texas, but she lives in California now, working in tech. She doesn't know much about land law or Texas bureaucracy. To her, the property was just numbers on a tax form. To me, it was everything. She put the land into a trust, hired a property management company to handle taxes and maintenance, and thought that would be enough. The problem is, land doesn't just need money, it needs watching. And while she was paying those bills from across state lines, the vultures started circling. Developers, surveyors, people who see empty space not as heritage, but as opportunity. When I came home from my second deployment, I expected to see that same dusty road, the same oak tree where I carved my initials, and that dam still glinting in the morning light. But the first thing I noticed was silence, the kind that feels wrong, the kind where the land doesn't sound like itself anymore. Then I saw them, bright orange stakes in the ground, concrete forms half set, men in reflective vests talking over blueprints that had nothing to do with me. It didn't register at first. I thought maybe the county was fixing a road or installing a power line. But as I walked further down the trail, past where Pops's cattle pens used to stand, I realized the truth. My land was gone. Or at least it looked like it. Fences torn out. Signs reading, "Future home of Willowbrook Estates Phase 2. I felt that sick heat rise behind my eyes, the kind you can't blink away. I marched up to the nearest man with a clipboard, asked him who gave him permission to build here. He laughed. "This is HOA property now," he said. "You must be the old owner." "Sorry, man. Times change. Times change." That's the kind of thing people say when they know they're doing something wrong but think they can get away with it. I drove straight to the courthouse to check the records. And that's when I learned what had happened while I was overseas. My sister had kept paying taxes, but she never read the reassessments. Somewhere along the line, the zoning had changed. Agricultural land reclassified as residential. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had filed an adverse possession claim saying the land had been abandoned and that they'd improved it through development. Legally, it's an old Texas law meant for homesteaders. But now, developers use it as a weapon. If you don't physically occupy your land for long enough, they can try to take it. I sat there in that dusty records office, staring at the paper, my stomach turning. They'd found a loophole while I was serving my country, and they exploited it. All because someone thought my grandfather's pastures would look better as tennis courts. That's when I first heard her name, Margaret Thornwell. 52 years old, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, married to city councilman Rick Thornwell. Every record I pulled had one of their signatures on it. Every zoning change, every property adjustment, every so-called improvement. It all traced back to them, and it wasn't just paperwork. They had plans, big ones. Roads, sewer lines, landscaping. They'd already sold off half the lots to families who had no idea they were buying stolen land. But what broke my heart wasn't the concrete or the money. It was the creek. When I walked back out there, I saw what they'd done. Pops's dam was still standing, but the creek feeding it had been redirected with an excavator. The water level had dropped so low that the mud cracked in long spiderweb lines. The cattails were dying, the frogs gone. The sound that used to hum through summer nights, running water, was silent. They'd cut the lifeline. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about property. It was about legacy. My family had been the stewards of that water for nearly 70 years, helping everyone downstream survive droughts and floods. And these people, these polished suburban invaders, had taken it all for beautification. I remember walking along that dry creek bed, the crunch of the dirt under my boots, the taste of dust in my mouth. I could almost hear Pops's voice in my head saying, "Don't let them take what's rightfully ours." I made a promise that day, to him, to myself, to the land. But the truth is, I was lost. I didn't know where to start. Developers had money, lawyers, influence. I had a pickup truck, some training, and a lot of anger. So I did what Pops always did when he faced a problem, started digging, literally and figuratively. I spent days in the county records office. Nights reading property law I barely understood. And somewhere between coffee cups and courthouse microfilm, I realized that Pops had already given me the answer decades earlier. His dam was federally approved. That meant the water, and the land that controlled it, was under federal jurisdiction. The HOA couldn't legally override that. No matter how many signatures they had, it was like finding buried treasure. I could almost feel him smiling. That old man had built me a time bomb without realizing it, a quiet kind of protection only good men think ahead to make. Still, I needed more proof, more leverage, so I dug deeper. Old deeds, forgotten surveys, handwritten notes. And that's when I found it, a water rights deed from 1923, my great-grandfather's signature at the bottom. Those water rights were older than the city itself. In Texas, whoever holds senior water rights owns the flow. Not the HOA, not the developers, not even the city council. Me. For the first time in months, I felt the land breathe again. The fight wasn't over, but I knew I had a weapon. It wasn't a gun or a lawsuit, it was the truth carved into history. That night, I sat by Pops's dam with a flashlight, flipping through his old journals. His handwriting was shaky near the end, but the words were clear. Help your neighbors. Protect the water. Keep the creek alive. I traced the letters with my thumb, and something inside me settled. The HOA had their rules. I had gravity, law, and legacy. They wanted to play games with zoning and money. I was about to remind them that water doesn't care about property lines. It remembers where it belongs. And before this story was over, so would they. The morning after I found out what the HOA had done, I stood on the edge of my property, looking out over what used to be my grandfather's back 40. The air smelled like wet concrete and diesel exhaust instead of wild grass and cedar, where I used to hunt deer with Pops. There were now survey flags flapping in the wind, half-built driveways, and a banner that read, Willowbrook Estates Phase 2, Luxury Living, starting at $750,000. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like someone had ripped pages out of my life and replaced them with advertisements. A construction worker waved at me, thinking I was a potential buyer. I didn't wave back. I kept walking until I reached the center of it all, the heart of Pops's land, and there she was. Margaret Maggie Thornwell. She was everything I'd imagined from the documents I'd read. Mid-50s, perfectly tanned, blonde hair styled like she was hosting a country club luncheon instead of running a construction site. She had that fake sweet voice that made you feel like you were being patted on the head right before the knife went in. She was talking to the foreman, clipboard in hand, barking orders in that syrupy southern drawl. I introduced myself. "You're standing on my land," I said. She looked me up and down, smiled like she was greeting a child, and said, "Oh, you must be the soldier." "Welcome home, sweetie. I'm afraid you're a little late. This property's part of Willowbrook Estates now." I felt something twist in my stomach. "No, ma'am. This is Morrison land. Has been since 1955. She didn't even flinch. "I'm sure you're very proud of your family history," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But you really should have taken better care of it." Then she turned her back on me and told the workers to keep pouring concrete. That's when I realized what kind of enemy I was dealing with. She wasn't just a bully. She was the kind of person who smiled while she stole from you and convinced everyone around her she was doing you a favor. The noise of heavy machinery drowned out the sound of the creek that used to run clear behind our dam. I looked toward it, but all I could see was dust. The water had been diverted through a makeshift trench lined with PVC pipes. They were sucking it away, literally draining life from the land. Pops's dam, the one he'd built with his own hands, was drying up before my eyes. I remember walking down to it that evening. The sun was low, the air thick with humidity. Every step I took crunched against the dry mud that used to be the dam's shoreline. Cracks spread across the earth like veins. I knelt down and touched the dirt. It was still warm from the day's heat, but lifeless. That's when I made up my mind. This wasn't going to stand. The next morning, I started calling lawyers. Most didn't even bother to return my calls. The one who did quoted me $85,000 just to start a zoning challenge. $85,000 for a chance, not a guarantee, to get my own land back. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. My stomach turned. It felt like everyone was in on it. Lawyers, councilmen, the HOA, maybe even the county office. A few days later, I started hearing stories from neighbors. The Chen family, who'd lived downstream for decades, said the creek behind their garden had dried up. Miguel Santos, who ran a small farm next to ours, told me his irrigation system had stopped working. Everything pointed to the same cause, the HOA's construction project. Maggie had redirected the creek to feed her fancy neighborhood's decorative ponds and fountains. The irony was sickening. They were turning my grandfather's irrigation system, built to help people, into a landscaping feature for million-dollar homes. So I went back to the courthouse, this time with a clear head and a chip on my shoulder. I spent 3 days there digging through old records. I found Pops's dam permit again. But I also found something else. The name of the consulting engineer who'd signed off on the project back in 1978. The Army Corps of Engineers had issued it under federal flood control guidelines. That meant it wasn't just a private dam. It was federal infrastructure. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Maggie had no idea what kind of hornet's nest she'd stirred up. When I went back home that evening, my sister Sarah called from California. She was crying. She'd gotten a letter from the HOA claiming we owed back taxes on abandoned land. They'd even threatened to sue her personally for damages to their construction schedule. I could hear the panic in her voice, and it made my blood boil. "Don't worry," I told her. "They picked the wrong guy to mess with." The next morning, I decided to pay Maggie another visit. She was hosting what she called a community safety meeting at the construction site. There were about 20 people there, all dressed like they'd just stepped out of a golf catalog. She was standing under a tent, microphone in hand, talking about neighborhood beautification and public safety concerns with my dam. Apparently, it was now a potential hazard to her new homes. I waited until she finished speaking, then stepped forward. "You're worried about safety?" I said. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you built houses in a flood zone," the crowd murmured. Maggie's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed just a bit. "Mr. Morrison," she said, pretending to be calm, "this isn't the place for hostility. We're simply ensuring our community's well-being." "Your community?" I said, my voice rising. "That's my family's land. You built on a federal watershed, and you didn't even bother checking the permits. You're not protecting your neighbors. You're endangering them." The foreman stepped between us, probably worried I'd do something stupid. I didn't. I just looked Maggie dead in the eye and said, "You don't get to rewrite history. My grandfather built that dam to help people, and I'm going to make sure it still does." I left before things got ugly, but I could feel her glare burning into my back as I walked away. That was the moment the lines were drawn. Over the next few weeks, the HOA started playing dirty. They sent me notices for noise violations because of the sound of my tractor. They filed complaints about unsightly property conditions. They even sent a health inspector to check my septic system, claiming it was contaminating their water supply. It had passed inspection 6 months earlier. They didn't care. The goal wasn't truth. It was pressure. Then came the wellness check. Rick, her husband, used his city council connections to call Veteran Services and report that I was unstable and a potential threat. A social worker showed up at my door with a clipboard and an apologetic smile. "We just want to make sure you're okay," she said. I told her I was fine. She nodded, took some notes, and left. But I could see Maggie parked at the edge of my driveway in her golf cart, sunglasses on, pretending not to watch. They were trying to break me down, one paper cut at a time. But what they didn't understand was that I'd been through worse. I'd built bridges in combat zones, survived sandstorms that could strip the paint off a truck, and spent months under fire fixing broken pipelines. Bureaucrats with clipboards didn't scare me. Instead of backing down, I doubled down. I called an old friend from the Corps, Tony Riggs. He worked for the EPA now. When I told him what was happening, he whistled low. "If they diverted a creek without federal approval," he said, "that's a Clean Water Act violation. Big one, too." He didn't have to say anything else. I knew I had him on my side. That night, I walked the perimeter of my property with a flashlight and started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, flow measurements, the whole 9 yards. I even set up trail cameras around the dam in case anyone tried to tamper with it. Every night I heard the same sounds. Engines, hammers, concrete trucks. It felt like they were trying to erase me piece by piece. But the land has a memory, just like Pop said, and it was on my side. One evening, as I stood at the edge of the dried-up creek bed, I saw something strange, a ripple of movement down in the mud. I knelt and brushed the dirt aside. Underneath was a trickle of water pushing its way through. It wasn't much, just a thin stream, but it was enough. Nature was still fighting back. And that gave me an idea. I went back inside and pulled out Pops's old journals again. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but his handwriting was still strong. One line stood out: "Built small spillway under dam. Emergency release to restore natural flow if creek ever blocked." That was it. The old man had built a safety system into the dam, one that could redirect the flow back to its natural path. It was designed to protect the community during floods. But now it could prove something even more important: that Maggie's development was the real danger, not my dam. I closed the journal and looked out the window at the distant construction lights glowing against the night sky. I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to destroy anything. I was going to remind everyone, including Maggie, who this land really belonged to. They'd taken my water, my peace, and my family's name. But they hadn't taken my fight. And before long, everyone in Willowbrook Estates was going to learn that you can't build paradise on stolen ground. Not without consequences. I didn't sleep much after finding that journal entry from Pops. His words kept echoing in my head. "Emergency spillway to restore natural flow if creek ever blocked." It was like he'd written it for this exact moment. Decades before Maggie Thornwell ever stepped foot on our land. The old man wasn't just building a dam. He was building insurance against greed and stupidity. And now, his foresight was my secret weapon. The next morning, I drove back to the county courthouse. The woman at the front desk gave me that tired look people reserve for troublemakers. "You again?" she said. "Third day this week." I smiled and said, "Guess I'm just trying to understand my own property." She sighed and waved me through. What I didn't tell her was that I was on a mission. I wasn't looking for trouble anymore. I was looking for proof. I spent hours in that dim, dusty records room, flipping through ledgers that smelled like old paper and sweat. My fingers were black with ink dust by the time I found what I was looking for: the original engineering plans for Pops's dam, dated 1978. I unfolded the brittle blueprints carefully, and there it was in his neat handwriting: spillway system, emergency flood control, and agricultural water restoration. Right beneath it, stamped in bold black ink, was the seal of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. My breath caught in my throat. That single stamp meant everything. Federal oversight. That phrase had power. It meant the dam wasn't just a local structure. It was recognized under federal jurisdiction. And here's the thing about federal jurisdiction. No HOA, no city council, no developer can override it without permission from Washington. D.C. Maggie had built her empire on land she didn't even have legal control over. She thought she was queen of Willowbrook Estates. She had no idea she'd built her throne on federal soil. I took photos of every document, every signature, every seal. I scanned the blueprint and saved it twice, one copy for me, one for insurance. Then I kept digging, because I knew Maggie and her husband weren't the type to stop at one scam. And that's when I found something even better. Buried in a dusty file marked Water Rights 1923 was an original deed transfer from my great-grandfather. The language was old and flowery, but the meaning was clear. The Morrison family held senior water rights for the entire Willow Creek watershed. That meant we didn't just own the dam. We owned the water itself, the flow, the distribution, the right to use it for agriculture and livestock. I sat there staring at that document, my pulse pounding. I could practically hear Pops laughing somewhere. This wasn't just leverage, it was checkmate. The Thornwells could mess with zoning, they could build on stolen dirt, but they couldn't touch the water. Not legally, not federally. I walked out of that courthouse into the Texas sun feeling 10 feet tall. The whole town looked different now. Every smiling face at the diner, every for sale sign, every shiny SUV felt like part of the same machine that had tried to chew me up. But I wasn't scared anymore. I had something they couldn't buy, couldn't bully, couldn't erase. The truth on paper, signed in ink older than their subdivision. When I got back home, I went straight to the dam. I climbed down the slope, past the wild grass and the cracked mud, until I reached the old spillway controls. The metal was rusted but solid. Pops built things to last. I brushed away some dirt, and there they were, 2 iron levers and a pressure gauge worn smooth from decades of Texas weather. I pulled one gently, and the valve hissed like a sleeping animal waking up. The sound gave me chills. It still worked. After all these years, it still worked. That's when I realized something else. If the spillway system was still operational, it meant I could restore the creek's natural flow whenever I wanted. And if I could restore it, I could prove Maggie's crew had broken federal law by diverting it. That single act would bring the EPA, the Army Corps, and possibly the Justice Department right to her doorstep. But first, I needed evidence. Real, undeniable proof. So, I started documenting everything. I bought a set of flow meters, took daily readings of the water levels, snapped time-stamped photos, and even set up trail cameras to monitor the creek. Every night, I'd upload the footage, back it up in 3 places, and make sure there was a digital trail that no one could dispute. While I was doing that, Maggie was waging her own war of perception. She posted on community boards that I was harassing workers, that I was unstable after military service. She even called the local news station and gave an interview about the dangerous dam threatening new homes. The anchor introduced her as a concerned community leader. I watched the segment in disbelief as she stood there in her perfect suburban outfit, talking about how this outdated dam could burst any day now. What she didn't mention was that her construction crews had dug too close to the creek bed, weakening the soil. Or that her husband had signed off on illegal water diversions. Or that she was sitting on the kind of environmental disaster that could bankrupt her entire development. But that's Maggie for you, lies wrapped in pearls. I started to see her pattern. She didn't just take land. She took control of the story. That's how she kept everyone on her side. The residents saw her as a savior, not a thief. So I decided to take that story back. I called Tony Riggs, my buddy from the EPA. He picked up on the first ring. "Jake," he said, "you sound like a man who's found something interesting." I told him everything. The dam permits, the water rights, the diverted creek. He went quiet for a second, then said, "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just local corruption. It's a federal violation of the Clean Water Act. You might have just opened a can of worms, my friend." "Good," I said. "Let them crawl." Tony told me what to do next. Document every change in the waterway. Record every piece of construction affecting the creek. Get witnesses, especially anyone downstream who'd lost water access. Once you have that, he said, we'll make it official. So that's what I did. I drove to every farm, every house along the old creek path. Mrs. Chen told me her garden had withered since the diversion. Miguel Santos showed me his cracked irrigation ditches. I recorded their testimonies, took photos, and kept adding to my growing pile of evidence. Every time someone told me how their water had disappeared, my resolve hardened. Pops built that dam to help these people. Maggie had turned it into a weapon against them. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just theft. It was an organized operation. Rick Thornwell, Maggie's husband, had been fast-tracking zoning changes while Maggie handled the PR. His construction company, Thornwell Development Group, was behind every contract. They'd done this before, too. I found records from a subdivision in Houston they'd built years earlier. Same pattern, same methods, same outcome. They stole land, diverted creeks, and left chaos behind. That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by boxes of documents, my walls covered in pinned notes and maps. It looked like a crime board from a detective movie. But this wasn't fiction. This was my life. Every arrow, every red string, every printed screenshot told the same story. They were building their wealth on lies. And my family's land was their latest victim. I didn't have money or influence. But I had something better: time, patience, and purpose. I started planning. Every move had to be precise. The next step was getting the EPA officially involved, but I needed to time it perfectly. If I moved too soon, they'd bury me in counterclaims. If I waited too long, they'd finish construction and seal the creek forever. Then something unexpected happened. The weather forecast called for heavy rain that weekend, 3 inches over 2 days. That meant one thing: the creek would rise. And when it did, their diversion would be exposed for the fraud it was. If the new channel couldn't handle the water, it would overflow back toward its natural path, right where Pops's dam directed it decades ago. Nature was about to become my ally. I spent that night at the dam, flashlight in hand, checking every valve and gate. The metal groaned as I tested the controls, but they still moved. I could almost feel Pops standing behind me, telling me to steady my hand. The storm clouds were gathering in the distance, rumbling like drums of justice. I smiled. "Let it rain," I whispered. Maggie and Rick thought they'd built an empire. They thought paperwork could rewrite history, that money could silence truth. But they forgot one simple thing. Water doesn't care about politics or property lines. It remembers its path, and it always finds its way home. By the time that storm hit, I'd be ready. And when the first drops fell, I knew it wouldn't just be rain washing through Willowbrook Estates. It would be reckoning. The rain came earlier than expected. That morning, the sky was the color of steel, and the air hung heavy with that electric tension that always comes before a storm. I stood on the porch watching clouds roll over the hills, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange calm. I'd spent weeks gathering proof, tracing signatures, digging through records, and setting traps of my own. Now, nature was about to do its part. I walked down toward the dam as the first drops hit my hat brim. The air smelled like wet clay and pine. Pops used to say rain in Texas could wash away lies if you gave it time. I was counting on that. The spillway gates groaned under the pressure of rising water, the sound low and angry like something alive. The level was climbing fast, and every inch meant trouble for the people who built their homes where the water was never supposed to go. While I was there checking the gauges, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the local community page. Maggie had posted again, another masterpiece of manipulation. She wrote about how a local man with a troubled past was threatening the safety of families in Willowbrook Estates. She included a blurry photo of me taken from a distance, probably by one of her HOA drones, and a caption that read, "Unstable veteran refuses to cooperate with authorities." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. She was playing the same card again, painting me as dangerous, unpredictable, unstable. I guess she thought if she said it enough, people would believe it, but people were starting to notice cracks in her story. Under her post were comments, some confused, others skeptical. One person wrote, "Didn't that dam get federal clearance years ago?" Another said, "Why would a veteran sabotage his own property?" The tide was turning, and she knew it. Her power wasn't real. It was built on fear and gossip, and those only work until the truth starts leaking through. By the afternoon, the rain was pouring hard enough to turn gravel roads into rivers. I pulled on my rain jacket, grabbed my camera, and headed for the creek diversion Maggie's crew had built. What I found was worse than I expected. The PVC pipe system they'd installed to reroute the water was failing. Water surged over the edges, carving new channels through the dirt. It was like the land itself was taking revenge, reclaiming its old flow path. I recorded everything. Slow-motion shots of the water tearing through their trenches, close-ups of erosion near the foundations of half-built houses. I wanted every frame documented for Tony and the EPA. Then I saw them. 3 men in reflective jackets standing near the diversion site, shouting orders over the rain. One of them was the same foreman who told me to get lost weeks earlier. I called out to him, but he ignored me. When I got closer, I saw why. They were trying to dump quick-set concrete into one of the overflow drains. They were literally trying to block the natural flow with cement. I yelled, "That's illegal!" But my voice was drowned by thunder. I started filming, zooming in on the concrete mixer, the bags labeled Rapid Set. One of them noticed me and shouted something I couldn't hear. I didn't care. Let them see me watching. Let them know the evidence was already on record. By the time I got back home, I was soaked to the bone. I made a pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and transferred the footage to my laptop. I watched the clips over and over, the sound of rain hammering the tin roof above me. Each frame felt like a piece of the puzzle snapping into place. When I was sure I had everything backed up, I called Tony. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me you've got something good," he said. "I've got video of them pouring concrete into the creek diversion during a storm." There was a long pause. Then he said, "Jake, that's a federal crime. You just caught them on tape committing a Clean Water Act violation. Keep everything safe. I'll escalate this tonight." That was the first time I felt real hope. Not just anger, not survival. Hope. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching on wet gravel. When I looked outside, I saw a white SUV with the HOA logo parked at my gate. 3 people were standing there in matching polo shirts holding clipboards. One of them raised a camera and started taking photos of my house, my truck, even my mailbox. I walked outside and asked what they thought they were doing. The woman in front, probably one of Maggie's board members, said, "We're conducting a neighborhood safety inspection." I laughed. "This isn't your neighborhood," I said. "It's my land," she smiled tightly. "For now." Then they got back in the SUV and drove off, leaving muddy tire tracks on my driveway. That's when it hit me. They were trying to provoke me. They wanted me to snap, to give them the angry veteran image they'd been selling to everyone online. But I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I decided to use their tactics against them. I called my lawyer, not the overpriced one from before, but a young woman named Amanda Cross. She'd just started her own firm and specialized in environmental law. When I explained the situation, she didn't sound surprised. "I've seen this before," she said. "Developers and HOAs using harassment and paperwork to scare owners off valuable land. But federal jurisdiction changes the game. If you've got proof of Army Corps' involvement in Clean Water Act violations, they're in serious trouble. I sent her everything. Blueprints, deeds, water readings, videos." She spent 2 hours reviewing it all and called me back. "Jake," she said, "this isn't a local dispute anymore. This is a federal environmental case waiting to happen." For the first time, someone was talking to me like I wasn't crazy. She agreed to take my case pro bono until we could file official complaints. That was the moment this stopped being just my fight. It became something bigger, a fight for everyone Maggie had ever bullied, fined, or threatened. But as soon as she got involved, the harassment escalated. I'd see unfamiliar trucks parked near my property line at night. My trail cameras caught men walking around with flashlights, pretending to be surveyors. Once I found a dead fish dumped at my doorstep with a note that said, "Enjoy your water while it lasts." I took photos of that, too. Every threat, every scare tactic went into my evidence folder. One evening, while I was reviewing footage, I caught something that made my blood run cold. 2 men, probably Maggie's hired hands, were tampering with one of my flow meters at the creek. They thought no one would notice in the dark, but the trail cam's infrared caught them clear as day. I sent the clip to Tony immediately. He called back within minutes. "This is good, Jake. This is really good. We're opening an investigation. Don't confront them. Just keep recording." So I did. Every day, every night, I recorded. The land became my witness. The creek, my ally. The camera, my weapon. A week later, I came home from town to find an official-looking envelope taped to my door. It was from the city council, signed by Rick Thornwell himself. The letter claimed my property was being reviewed for public safety violations and that the city might have to step in to protect residents from potential dam failure. In other words, they were trying to seize my land under eminent domain. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that letter, feeling a cold, steady anger take root in my chest. They weren't just trying to scare me anymore. They were trying to erase me completely. Amanda told me to stay calm, to let the legal process play out. "If they file for eminent domain," she said, "we'll counter with federal environmental protection claims. Their own paperwork will hang them." She was right, but waiting was the hardest part. Every day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of snakes. Meanwhile, Maggie wasn't letting up. She called a press conference in front of her pristine White House, cameras flashing as she stood there pretending to cry. "We just want our children to be safe," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "This man's outdated dam is a ticking time bomb." I watched the broadcast on my laptop and almost laughed. The woman should have been an actress. What she didn't know was that Tony's team had already flagged her development for investigation. The EPA was preparing to send inspectors to verify my claims. I could almost picture her face when they showed up unannounced with clipboards and federal badges. The rain kept coming for 2 more days, and the creek swelled higher than it had in years. The water started cutting through the cheap soil Maggie's crews had dumped in the diversion. By the 3rd day, the redirected creek broke completely, roaring back into its old path with a force that shook the ground. I stood on the dam watching the water pour through, muddy but strong, carving its way home like it remembered every bend and curve. I filmed everything: the spillway, the rushing current, the water reclaiming what was stolen. It wasn't destruction. It was restoration. Nature correcting the arrogance of people who thought they could own it. When I sent the footage to Amanda and Tony, they both said the same thing. "This changes everything." That night, I sat by the window, listening to the rain hit the roof. And for the first time in months, I felt like Pops was right there with me. The creek was alive again. The land was breathing. And the fight was no longer about me. It was about something bigger: justice, legacy, and the simple truth that water always finds its way home. Maggie and Rick still had their lawyers, their influence, their headlines. But I had something stronger: time, proof, and patience. They thought they could drown me in paperwork and lies. They forgot I'd been trained to build bridges in floods and dig trenches in storms. I knew how to survive pressure. The war had begun, and I was ready for every single round. The morning after the storm broke, I woke up to silence. Not the kind of silence that means peace, but the heavy kind that hangs in the air right before chaos unfolds. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, and the world smelled like wet dirt, cedar, and something sharp, like change. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The creek was alive again, roaring through its rightful path. Water shimmered under the weak morning sun, tearing through the trenches Maggie's crew had dug. Nature had done what I couldn't. It had taken back what belonged to it. I followed the sound of rushing water until I reached the dam. The spillway was open, just like Pops designed it. The floodgate was holding, and the water flowed smooth and strong, feeding the land downstream. It was beautiful, chaotic and beautiful. I stood there in the mud, watching the power of it, realizing that this was exactly what Maggie and Rick had tried to stop. They wanted control, order, and obedience. But water doesn't obey. It remembers where it's meant to go. As I stood there, a pickup truck appeared on the ridge above the dam. 2 men got out, one of them the same foreman I'd seen before. The other wore a dark rain jacket and a hat pulled low. They climbed down the hill, shouting something I couldn't hear over the roar of the creek. I stayed still, camera in hand. When they got close enough, the foreman yelled, "You're going to pay for this, Morrison! You broke the diversion. You flooded half the development." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, son." The rain did that. "You built in the wrong place." He started toward me, fists clenched, but the man in the hat grabbed his arm and held him back. "Not here," he muttered. His voice was calm, too calm. He looked at me for a long moment before turning and walking back up the hill. Something about him made my skin crawl. He wasn't a worker. He was someone higher up, someone used to making problems disappear. When they left, I took out my phone and started filming again. The washed-out diversion, the flooded construction site, the exposed rebar, everything. The HOA and their developers had no one to blame but themselves. I sent the footage to Amanda and Tony right away. Within an hour, Tony called back. "Jake," he said, "the EPA's sending a team out today. They want to inspect the damage firsthand. Don't talk to anyone until they arrive." By noon, the inspectors showed up. 2 black SUVs, government plates, and 4 people in jackets marked EPA and Army Corps of Engineers. The kind of people who don't waste words. They introduced themselves, shook my hand, and asked to see the dam. I led them down the muddy path, explaining everything: the diverted creek, the illegal concrete dumping, the rapid set mix, all of it. They took photos, samples, measurements. Every time they saw something wrong, they exchanged those silent looks professionals give when they know a case is bad. One of them, a tall woman named Daniels, turned to me and said, "Mr. Morrison, did you authorize any of this construction?" "Not a chance," I said. "This is my grandfather's dam. Been here since the 70s. They built that subdivision without proper zoning or environmental clearance." She nodded slowly. "You've done good work documenting this. You might have saved this creek." Those words hit harder than I expected. For months, I'd been treated like the crazy neighbor. Hearing it from a federal agent felt like oxygen after drowning. That evening, the storm clouds cleared and the sun broke through. The inspectors left, promising to file their preliminary report by morning. I went back inside, exhausted but alive. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and just listened to the sound of the creek outside. The land felt right again, balanced, like it had been waiting for this moment. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I looked out the window and saw a black Cadillac SUV rolling up slow, like a shark circling. The passenger window rolled down, and out stepped Rick Thornwell himself. He was everything I imagined, a man used to shaking hands that made things disappear. Perfect suit, fake smile, eyes like polished marble. He walked up to the porch like he owned it. "Mr. Morrison," he said, extending his hand. I didn't take it. "You've caused quite a mess," he continued. "My wife's been very distressed." I crossed my arms. "You built on stolen land, diverted a federal waterway, and ignored permits. I'd say you caused your own mess." He smirked, like I was amusing him. "I understand you've been talking to the EPA, that's fine. But you should know, these things can get complicated, expensive. You're a military man, right? Practical. Maybe it's time we talk about a settlement." That word, settlement, hung in the air like poison. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "We'll buy you out," he said. "Fair market value plus a bonus for your trouble. You walk away and we all get to move on. No more fighting, no more bad press." I stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "You're trying to pay me to forget my grandfather's land?" He shrugged. "Call it compensation for your inconvenience. Think about it, Jake. No one wins these fights. You'll drown in paperwork before you see a dime. You want to spend the next 5 years in court, or do you want to live your life?" I smiled faintly and said, "You know, that's the problem with people like you. You think everything has a price, but some things aren't for sale." His expression hardened. The mask slipped just enough for me to see the contempt underneath. "Then I hope you're ready for what comes next," he said quietly, "because you're standing in the way of progress." He turned and walked back to his SUV without another word. As the car disappeared down the road, I realized the fight had officially gone from petty harassment to all-out war. They'd tried intimidation, lies, and manipulation. Now they were going to use power, the kind that doesn't show up in headlines but shows up in bank accounts and closed-door meetings. That night, Amanda called with updates. "The EPA filed an emergency injunction," she said. "Construction at Willowbrook Estates is officially suspended pending investigation." I closed my eyes and exhaled. "So what happens now?" They'll fight it, she said. Rick and Maggie will throw everything they have at this. But for now, the law's on your side. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. 2 days later, Maggie went on the offensive again. She called a town hall meeting at the community center, inviting every resident, local reporter, and city official. Her invitation said the meeting was about public safety and property protection. I showed up anyway, sitting quietly in the back. The place was packed, dozens of families, all looking confused, nervous, and angry. Maggie took the stage, dressed in her usual perfection. She started with a trembling voice, pretending to be the victim. "Our homes are at risk," she said. "That dam is dangerous. We can't let one man's obsession destroy our community," the crowd murmured. Some nodded. Others looked uneasy. Then she pointed toward me. "He's here tonight," she said, voice rising. "Ask him why he won't let go of land he hasn't cared for in years. Ask him why he's putting our children in danger." The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward me. I stood up slowly, my heart steady. "You want to talk about danger?" I said. "Let's talk about how you diverted a creek, poured concrete into a federal waterway, and ignored safety regulations. Let's talk about the flood that washed through your own subdivision because you thought you knew better than nature." Someone in the back clapped. Then another. Maggie's face tightened, her fake smile cracking. I kept going. "My grandfather built that dam to protect this land, not to own it, to care for it. You talk about safety, but the truth is you're scared of being caught." The crowd started buzzing, people whispering, reporters taking notes. Maggie tried to speak again, but her voice shook this time. I walked out before she could finish. I didn't need to hear more. The truth was already out there, spreading like water through dry soil. That night, my phone buzzed nonstop. People who'd once ignored me were now reaching out. Neighbors, farmers, even some Willowbrook residents. They'd seen the news. They'd read the injunction. They wanted to know the real story. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about reclaiming my land anymore. It was about reclaiming trust. About reminding people that legacy means more than profit, that land is more than dirt. It's memory, responsibility, and history. I walked back to the dam one last time before the sun set. The creek ran clear again, reflecting the orange sky like glass. I thought of Pops, of all those years he spent building something that would outlast him. And I understood now he wasn't just building for the family. He was building for everyone who believed that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the enemy. The water whispered against the rocks, steady and alive. I didn't need to say anything. The land spoke for itself. The fight wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. They could file lawsuits, make headlines, even send more men in dark suits to my door. But I wasn't backing down. Because you can't buy back respect once you've sold your soul. And Maggie and Rick Thornwell were about to learn that when you build lies on sacred ground, the truth always rises, with the rain, with the river, and with the people who remember where it all began. The weeks that followed that town hall meeting felt like living inside a pressure cooker. Every news station within 100 miles picked up the story. Local veteran battles HOA over ancestral land. Some made me sound like a hero. Others made me sound like a lunatic with a shovel and a grudge. But I didn't care anymore. What mattered was that people were finally paying attention. Maggie and Rick weren't the only ones in control of the narrative now. The truth was leaking out, and no amount of HOA press releases could stop it. Still, I knew the Thornwells weren't the type to go down quietly. Their silence after the meeting was too loud, too deliberate. Whenever powerful people go quiet, it means they're moving pieces behind the curtain. I could feel it, like a storm building under my feet. A few days later, I got my confirmation. I was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, when a county sheriff's truck pulled up the driveway. The deputy stepped out, a young guy, nervous, eyes darting everywhere but my face. He handed me an envelope. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "I'm supposed to deliver this to you personally." The paper was thick, official, and heavy in my hand. I tore it open and read the first line. Notice of temporary injunction. Morrison Dam operation suspended pending safety review. They'd done it. Rick had pulled enough strings at City Hall to temporarily shut down my dam under the guise of public safety. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was. They couldn't win legally, so they were trying to drown me in bureaucracy. The deputy shifted on his feet. "Look, sir," he said quietly. "Between you and me, they're saying this came from the council's office, but there's pressure from higher up. Be careful." Then he tipped his hat and drove off. That warning stuck with me. I knew the Thornwells had influence, but higher up meant someone with political muscle, someone Rick had promised campaign donations or favors. That meant this was no longer just a local fight. It had gone statewide. I called Amanda immediately. She sighed when I read the letter to her. "They're playing chess, Jake," she said. "They're trying to buy time until the EPA report comes out. But this injunction? It's weak. We'll appeal it." I could hear her typing furiously in the background. "Just don't touch the dam. Not a valve, not a bolt. Let's keep it clean. We'll beat them on paper." I wanted to trust her, but I knew Maggie and Rick didn't care about rules. That night, I set up extra trail cameras around the property, near the dam and the old access road. I had a gut feeling they wouldn't wait for the courts. 3 nights later, my gut was proven right. It was just past midnight. The moon was high, silver light cutting through thin fog. I was half asleep when I heard it. Metal scraping, distant voices. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. Down by the dam, faint beams of light danced like fireflies. I moved quietly, my boots sinking into wet grass, heart pounding in my chest. When I got close enough, I saw 3 figures near the spillway. They were prying at the gate mechanism, trying to jam it open. One of them had a crowbar. The others were shining flashlights and whispering orders. I started filming immediately. My hands shook, but I kept the camera steady. "Hey!" I shouted. "You're trespassing!" They froze, then bolted for the access road. I ran after them, catching a glimpse of their truck, a dark utility vehicle with no plates. They tore off into the night, leaving the gate half broken and the mud torn up from their tires. I called Amanda first, then Tony. They both told me the same thing. Document everything. Don't engage again and send the footage immediately. Tony's voice was grim. They're getting desperate, he said. If they tamper with that dam and cause flooding, they're looking at federal charges. But don't underestimate them. People like that don't go down easy. By morning, the EPA had sent another team to inspect the damage. They confirmed what I already knew. The gate mechanism had been deliberately sabotaged. The irony was that the sabotage itself was a bigger legal offense than anything I'd ever done. Maggie and Rick had just given me the ammunition I needed. But if I'd learned anything from this war, it was that every win came with retaliation. And sure enough, the next day my mailbox was stuffed with new papers. Property tax reassessment, noise violation, zoning review notice, code compliance request. It was an avalanche of red tape. They were trying to bury me alive under the weight of paperwork. Then came the smear campaign. Rick used his city council connections to leak selective information to the press. Anonymous sources claimed I'd threatened workers and interfered with public safety efforts. They even dredged up an old service injury report from my military file, twisting it into a story about mental instability. The local station ran the headline, "Veterans' erratic behavior raises concerns in ongoing property dispute." That one hurt more than I expected. Not because of what they said about me, but because of what it said about people. How easily the truth can be drowned out by louder lies. Still, there were cracks forming in their wall. The EPA report wasn't just damning, it was explosive. Tony called me one night, his voice full of energy. "Jake, you're not going to believe this," he said. "The Willowbrook construction site? It's a textbook violation of the Clean Water Act. Unauthorized diversion, unpermitted fill material, contamination risk, the works. Once this goes public, they're finished." "Finished?" I asked, not daring to hope. "As in multi-million-dollar fines and possibly jail time." "You did it, man." For a moment, I just sat there in silence. The weight of everything, the months of fighting, the sleepless nights, the fear, the anger, suddenly felt lighter. Maybe finally it was over. But it wasn't. Not yet. The very next morning, my phone rang before sunrise. It was Amanda. Jake, listen to me carefully, she said, her voice sharp. Rick's been arrested. The EPA filed charges. But Maggie, she's gone. Gone? I said, what do you mean gone? She left town, deleted her social media, shut down the HOA's accounts, transferred the development company's assets. She's running. For a second, I didn't know whether to laugh or swear. Maggie Thornwell, Queen of Control, had finally lost it, but something about it didn't sit right. People like her don't run unless they have somewhere to go and something left to protect. That afternoon, I drove down to the construction site. The place was abandoned. Half-finished homes stood like skeletons, their windows empty, walls streaked with mud. The HOA office trailer was gone, tire tracks cutting through the field where it had stood. The silence was eerie. I walked the site until I reached the creek. The water ran clean and steady, the mud drying along its banks. The dam stood tall behind it, strong and unbroken. For the first time, it looked exactly as Pops intended, untouched, pure, alive. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something half buried in the dirt near the old diversion channel. I brushed it off with my boot. It was a gold HOA nameplate, Margaret Thornwell, President. I picked it up, wiped off the mud, and just stared at it. That little piece of metal represented everything this fight had been about. Greed, control, pride. And now, it was worthless. The EPA finished their investigation a week later. Their final report was brutal. They accused the Willowbrook HOA and Thornwell Development of environmental negligence, falsified permits, and obstruction of federal oversight. The fines were in the millions. Rick's arrest made headlines statewide. Maggie, though, was still missing. People in town started calling me a hero. Some even came by the ranch to shake my hand. But I didn't feel like one. Heroes win clean battles. Mine had been ugly, exhausting, and personal. This wasn't victory. It was survival. One evening, as I sat by the dam watching the sunset, Sarah called. Her voice was soft, tired, but proud. Pops would have been proud of you, she said. You saved his land. I didn't say anything for a while. I just listened to the water running over the spillway, steady and sure. I didn't save it, I finally said. It saved me. Because somewhere along the line, this fight stopped being about land. It became about remembering who we are when the world tries to erase us. About standing firm when power tells you to sit down. The land was quiet again, but not silent. I could hear frogs in the distance, the faint hum of crickets, the creak of water against rock. Life was back. As the last light faded over the hills, I realized something. Maggie might have vanished, but her kind never really does. There will always be more like her, people who see history as profit, who mistake legacy for leverage. But there will also always be people like Pops, like me, like anyone who still believes that what's right can't be bulldozed. The war for this land had taken nearly everything from me. My peace, my sleep, even parts of myself I didn't know I'd lost, but it gave me something back too. Purpose. And maybe that's what Pops meant all those years ago when he said water remembers. Because this land remembered me. It remembered my family. It remembered what it was meant to be. Now, when the wind moves through the grass and the creek hums beneath the sky, I swear I can hear him. Not words, not ghosts, just the rhythm of something eternal. The kind of truth no developer, no HOA, no amount of money can ever bury. The land endures. The water endures. And so do I. The weeks after the EPA report felt like standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite define. The war was over, at least on paper. The Thornwells were gone. Their empire crumbled, their name dragging through every news outlet across Texas. But victory didn't feel the way I thought it would. There wasn't any cheering, no satisfaction. Just quiet, heavy, haunting quiet. The kind that makes you realize the cost of fighting for something you can never get back completely. The land looked healed from a distance. The creek had found its rhythm again, carving its old path with a gentle, familiar hum. Grass was growing where construction had once scarred the earth. Birds had returned, nesting in the old oak trees by the dam. Every morning, mist rolled over the water just like it used to when Pops was alive. But if you looked closer, the scars were still there. Trenches that would take years to fill. Bare patches of ground where concrete had choked the soil. and the twisted remains of rebar poking up like rusted bones. I'd won, technically. The court had reinstated full ownership of the property to me, and the federal government had declared the area a protected watershed zone. No more development, no more zoning changes. The land was safe, but I wasn't. I'd spent so many months living in fight mode that I didn't know how to stop. Every sound outside at night still made me reach for my flashlight. Every envelope in the mailbox made my heart race. That kind of vigilance doesn't just fade, it lingers, seeps into your bones. One morning, as I was repairing a fence along the property line, an old pickup rolled down the dirt road. It was Miguel Santos, my neighbor from the next farm over. He climbed out, his hat pulled low against the sun. "Heard you're finally free," he said, smiling. "Figured I'd come shake your hand before some new trouble starts." I laughed. "Appreciate it, Miguel. Can't promise there won't be trouble, though." He looked around at the creek, the dam, the fields. "Looks good. Different but good. Like it's waking up again." That's when it hit me. He was right. The land wasn't just surviving. It was rebuilding, the same way I was. Nature doesn't rush recovery. It just keeps moving, steady and sure. A few days later, the county held a community meeting to discuss what would happen to the abandoned Willowbrook Estates project. They invited me, probably out of obligation, but I went anyway. The same faces that once whispered about me now nodded respectfully when I walked in. Funny how quickly people change sides once the truth comes out. The mayor stood at the front, clearing his throat awkwardly before speaking. "Given recent legal findings," he said, "the Willowbrook subdivision will be decommissioned. The remaining land will revert to agricultural zoning. The Morrison Dam and watershed area will be designated as a local heritage site." Heritage site. That word stuck with me. I didn't need monuments or plaques. But the idea that my grandfather's work, his quiet, honest labor, would be recognized as something worth preserving made my chest tighten. Pops never wanted fame. He just wanted the land to stay alive. Now, even after all this, it would. After the meeting, a young reporter caught up to me in the parking lot. She had a microphone in one hand and that eager look journalists get when they smell a good story. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "you've been called the man who stood up to the most powerful HOA in Texas. What would you say to people facing similar battles?" I thought for a moment. "Don't fight for revenge," I said quietly. "Fight for what's right. Because revenge dies when the other person's gone. But doing the right thing, doing what your conscience can live with, that lasts." She nodded, scribbling in her notebook, but I could tell she didn't fully understand. Most people don't until they've lost something that can't be replaced. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fireflies drift over the fields. I remembered the first night I came home from overseas, the same porch, the same land, but a different man. Back then, I thought the world had already shown me its worst. Turns out, the worst doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a gun. Sometimes it wears a smile and carries a clipboard. But I also learned that the best kind of strength isn't loud or violent. It's patient. It's the strength of water wearing down rock, of roots breaking through concrete. It's the kind of strength Pops had, the kind that endures. In the following months, the government's cleanup crews came and went. They removed debris, stabilized the creek, replanted native grass. The dam was inspected, certified safe, and added to the state's environmental preservation list. They even installed a small plaque near the spillway. Morrison Dam, constructed 1978, dedicated to the stewardship of land and water. I didn't ask for it, but seeing Pops's name there brought tears I didn't expect. Sometimes I'd catch locals stopping by to take photos, kids tossing stones into the creek, families picnicking nearby. The land had become something bigger than just property. It was part of the community again. That made me proud, but it also reminded me of how close we came to losing it. Then one afternoon, as I was hauling feed back to the barn, I saw a car parked near the road. A black sedan, engine running. My stomach tightened. I walked over slowly, ready for anything. The driver's window rolled down, and there she was. Maggie Thornwell. Her hair was shorter now, darker. No jewelry, no expensive clothes, no army of board members behind her. "Just her, pale and tired, Jake," she said softly. "Can we talk?" I didn't move. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here. I know, she said. I just needed to see it. The land, the water. I wanted to see what it looked like after. She trailed off, looking toward the dam. You wanted to see what survived? I said. She nodded. For a long moment, we just stood there, the sound of the creek filling the silence between us. Then she said, I lost everything. Rick's in prison. The company's gone. I can't even get a job under my own name anymore. But the thing that hurts most is that I thought I was building something good. I really believed it. I studied her face, searching for the smugness that used to live there, but it was gone. What was left was just regret. Good intentions don't excuse bad actions, I said. You didn't build anything. You destroyed what was already good. She looked down, nodding slowly. You're right, and I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that. Then she turned, got back in her car, and drove away. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, listening to the wind move through the trees. I didn't forgive her. Some things aren't meant to be forgiven. But I did feel something like closure. The war between us was over. Not because I'd won, but because she finally understood what she'd lost. As the months turned to a year, the rhythm of life returned. The dam became part of my daily routine again. I'd check the gates at sunrise, watch the reflection of the sky ripple in the water, and feel that deep sense of peace that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. One evening, I found Sarah sitting on the porch when I got home. She'd flown in from California without telling me. We sat in silence for a while before she said, I forgot what it sounded like out here. You don't hear this kind of quiet in the city. I smiled. That's not quiet. That's the sound of everything working like it should. She laughed softly, then looked at the dam. You did it, you know. You kept it alive? I didn't say anything. I just watched the water glint in the fading light. Pops used to say that land doesn't belong to us. It just borrows our hands for a while. Now I finally understood what he meant. The fight wasn't about ownership. It was about stewardship, responsibility, legacy. When Sarah left the next morning, she hugged me tighter than she ever had before. Don't let it go to waste, she whispered. I promised her I wouldn't. The seasons changed, and the land flourished. Wildflowers covered the hills, deer returned to the creek, and the air carried the scent of mesquite and rain again. Every sound, every smell, every breeze felt like a promise kept. Sometimes I still catch myself talking to Pops when I'm out there alone. I'll tell him about the rains, the repairs, the people who come to visit the dam. Maybe he hears me. Maybe he doesn't. But I like to think he's proud. People in town still talk about what happened, the Morrison versus HOA saga, as they call it, but to me, it's not a story about a fight. It's a story about endurance, about how land, like truth, outlasts lies, about how water, no matter how many times you try to block it, always finds its way home. And sometimes, when the sun sets just right and the light hits the dam at the perfect angle, I swear I can see Pop standing there. Old hat, hands on his hips, looking out over the water like he used to. And in those moments, I know one thing for sure. The land remembers. It always remembers, so I stay. I work, I keep it alive. Because that's what you do when something sacred chooses you as its keeper. You don't sell it. You don't run from it. You fight for it. And when the fight is over, you protect it. Not with force, but with care. The story of this land isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who ever believed that right can outlast wrong, that truth can outlast power, and that no matter how deep they bury it, justice, like water, always rises. The years after the storm, after the trials, after Maggie's apology and Rick's conviction, passed slowly. Like the land itself was teaching me how to breathe again. I thought the noise would end once the courts were finished and the headlines moved on, but it didn't. It just changed its tone. Where there had once been shouting, engines, and drills, now there was wind through the grass, the creak of trees, the call of distant birds. It wasn't silence, it was healing. Real, slow, unsteady healing. Each morning I walked down the dirt road that cut through my property, boots sinking slightly into soft soil still wet from the last rain. The air smelled like mesquite and clay. The creek glittered in the dawn light, winding through the land like a silver scar that refused to fade. The dam stood tall again, its structure cleaned, repaired, and repainted. I'd hired local hands to help rebuild what the storm and sabotage had damaged. Not workers, neighbors, people who remembered my grandfather, who'd drawn water from this place back when it fed more than one farm. They worked not for a paycheck, but for something older, quieter, a sense that what we were fixing mattered. I'd wake up before sunrise, the way Pops always did, and drink my coffee on the porch. The world looked different in those hours before light took over. Mist hung low across the fields, and sometimes, when the wind moved just right, I could hear the faint hum of the water hitting the rocks below. It sounded like music, like the land was singing to itself again. The news had stopped calling months ago. The EPA wrapped up their final report, and the county declared the Morrison property a historic conservation zone. No more HOAs, no more zoning wars. They even built a small wooden sign near the entrance that said Morrison Watershed Reserve. Tourists sometimes stopped to take photos, but most just passed through, quiet and respectful. I didn't mind. The land had earned its peace, and I wasn't about to guard it like a trophy. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the fight sometimes. Not the anger or the paperwork, but the purpose. For a long time, waking up every day meant preparing for battle. Letters, court hearings, threats, evidence. My body had learned to live in tension. When it was gone, the stillness felt foreign, too calm, too easy. It took time to learn how to live again without enemies. I spent that time restoring what was left. The creek's banks had eroded in places, so I planted native grass and willow saplings to hold the soil together. I cleared out rusted metal, old stakes, and debris from the construction site. Little by little, the ground softened again. The frogs came back first, then the fish, then the deer. Nature has a way of forgiving faster than people do. One evening, a young man from the local university came by. He introduced himself as Daniel, a student studying environmental science. "I've read about your case," he said, eyes wide with that mix of curiosity and reverence you only see in people who still believe in the world's potential. "We're doing a project on community-led conservation, and your dam is a perfect example." I wasn't used to hearing words like example or case study attached to something so personal, but I agreed to let him take samples and photos. He spent hours testing the water, taking notes, asking questions about the land's history. Before he left, he said something that stuck with me. "You know, you didn't just save your family's property. You saved a living ecosystem. It's rare to see someone fight for something that can't speak for itself." That night, I sat by the dam long after the sun went down, thinking about what he said. Maybe that's what this whole war had been about, speaking for something voiceless. For the land, for the water, for the people who had long forgotten that both were living things. Pops used to say that when you take care of the land, it takes care of you in return. Back then, I thought he meant crops or cattle. Now I knew better. He meant purpose. He meant peace. A few months later, I started getting letters again. But not from lawyers this time. From people. Farmers from other counties, homeowners from different states. Even a retired Army engineer who'd seen the news and wanted to thank me for reminding the country that not all progress comes from concrete. Some shared their own stories about lost land, corrupt HOAs, environmental battles. Reading their words, I realized my fight had become a symbol. What happened here wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been pushed out, silenced, or told they were powerless. So I decided to do something with it. I partnered with the local college and started a small foundation in Pops's name, the Morrison Land Stewardship Fund. Its goal was simple: help people protect their land, their water, their heritage. I didn't know anything about running a foundation, but I knew how to tell a story, and that was enough. Once the right people heard it, donations started to come in, slowly at first, then steadily. We helped the Chen family downstream repair their irrigation systems. We advised another farmer 2 towns over on how to fight a similar land grab. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something instead of defending it. Every time I met someone new through the foundation, I saw the same look in their eyes, the mix of fear and hope I'd once carried. I'd tell them what Pops told me. Land doesn't need to be owned. It needs to be respected. You don't fight for it because it's yours. You fight for it because it's right. It became a kind of mantra, one that guided everything I did. I started speaking at community halls, small-town meetings, even environmental conferences. Standing on those stages felt strange. I wasn't a politician or an academic. I was just a man who refused to give up. But maybe that's why people listened. I wasn't selling hope. I was proof that standing your ground still mattered in a world that moved too fast to care. One day, after a talk in Austin, an old woman approached me. She handed me a faded photograph of a dam that looked just like mine, except older, overgrown with vines. "My husband built that one in '62, she said. "Developers filled it in 5 years ago. You reminded me that maybe it's not too late to fight back." I took the picture and promised her it wasn't. Back home, the seasons rolled on. Spring brought wildflowers so bright they looked painted onto the earth. Summer made the air shimmer above the water, and the smell of fresh rain on hot soil filled the valley. Autumn was my favorite. Cool mornings, golden light, the sound of leaves falling into the creek. I started keeping Pops's old journal on the porch table, reading a page or two every night. His words felt like prayers now, written not for himself, but for whoever came after. One entry near the back caught me off guard. "When the time comes that this land must be defended again, I hope the one holding the line remembers that he's not fighting to win. He's fighting to endure." I closed the book and stared out at the dam, realizing he'd known exactly what would happen someday. He'd built the foundation, and I'd just carried it forward. Years later, people still come to visit the Morrison Dam. Some come to see history, others to see beauty. But every so often, someone will stand quietly, eyes closed, like they're listening. They might not know what they're hearing, but I do. It's the sound of water remembering, the steady rhythm of legacy flowing forward. I've grown older now. The lines on my hands match the cracks in the old wooden railing by the dam. My hair's gone gray, but my spirit feels young every time I hear the creek running. Sarah visits every summer with her kids. They run barefoot through the fields, laughing, chasing frogs just like I used to. Sometimes they ask about the fight, about the bad people who tried to take the land. I tell them the truth in simple words. They forgot what this place meant, but the land reminded them. As the sun sets behind the hills, the sky turns the color of fire and honey. The water glows gold, moving slow and sure toward the horizon. I sit there and let the sound wash over me, the sound of something ancient and eternal. This story, my story, isn't about revenge or even justice anymore. It's about remembering. Remembering that the things we build with honesty outlast the things built with greed. Remembering that no matter how deep they bury the truth, it rises like water through soil. The HOA is gone. The lawsuits are over. The headlines have faded. But the creek still runs. The dam still stands. And every ripple that touches its surface carries with it the memory of everyone who fought to keep it alive. When people ask me if it was worth it, if years of struggle, sleepless nights, and fear were worth saving a few acres of land, I don't answer with words. I take them to the edge of the dam at sunrise. I let them see the mist curling off the water, the light breaking through the trees, the sound of life returning. And when they finally fall silent, I just say, "That's your answer." Because some victories don't need applause. They just need to keep breathing. The land doesn't forget. The water doesn't forgive or condemn. It just moves forward. And maybe that's what I've learned, too. After everything, I don't live here to guard the past anymore. I live here to guide the future, to make sure that long after I'm gone, when someone else walks this ground and hears that same soft hum of water, they'll know someone once stood here and refused to let it die. And that, more than any court win or headline, is the real ending to this story. The land endured. The water endured. And so did the truth.